When we started thinking about this conference, when we were fishing for the right date for it, we certainly wanted it to happen after Glasgow. And you remember that COP26 ended on the 12th of November. So we naturally want to discuss the recent changes in the industry and, if you like, global landscape. If you read global press, you will see that lots of people are really frustrated at the low level of ambition seen from many countries. I actually think that Russia has done pretty good preparation for the COP26. COP26, in a sense, is like the Olympics. We usually do not postpone or cancel them. The Olympics were recently postponed. And I actually think it was one of the few events of this kind that Russia actually prepared well for. I'm glad that Russia attended Glasgow not empty-handed, and the position and the proposal voiced by the Russian Federation are quite feasible and quite sensible, in my opinion. So I believe we need to discuss the current state of the economy and the dependence of the economy on the climate policy. Climate policy today seems to have completely replaced trade, what used to be called trade and economic relations between states or countries. Climate is now the be-all and end-all. Climate is the only platform where countries are trying to increase their competitiveness and actually wrestle away some preferences in international trade. So I should probably start by describing where we stand and the risks and opportunities which exist for the Russian economy. The chart here shows that the potential for inertia-based growth, or growth in the BAU scenario, fluctuates between 2% to about 1.2% around 2040, which means that we are looking at CAGR of about 1.6, maybe 1.8%. With this kind of growth, we cannot count on much in the global economy, and if we don't like it, we should act. The big issue we have is that we are lagging behind technologically. And because of this lag, we're not just losing in the international trade. We're sort of getting stuck in terms of our GDP trap. We are lagging behind the global leaders, and the countries that so far have been behind us in terms of GDP per capita are now starting to put pressure and are about to overcome it. Climate agenda is inextricably linked to technologies. Developed countries, such as Europe, are promoting climate agenda because climate agenda can be furthered, fighting climate issues requires technologies, and technologies often help economic development. Prior to the Glasgow summit, over 10 more national strategies were published. On the 29th of October, as you certainly know, Russian government endorsed low-carbon socio-economic development strategy until 2050. So if we combine all these announcements and strategies, we can actually try predicting the evolution in emissions and a number of other indicators. This is a chart I think we previously showed. So coal and oil are expected to experience flagging and diminishing demand. Not the case with gas. Now, if this is true, then combined emissions by 2050 will drop by roughly 10 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, the way it works for Russia is like this. The good news is that demand for Russian energy, for Russian fuels, will probably go down slower than global demand. This is due to geography. This is due to the expert geography of Russian hydrocarbons. And this is also due to the fact that Russian energy resources are still very competitive. This is true even for the coal markets, not just for oil and gas. Now, this means that Russia will be in a pretty comfortable position for the next 15 years. However, the proceeds from exports of hydrocarbons to be enjoyed in the following 10 or 15 years need to be invested properly. And this is a very important consideration for the business because corporations exist for the benefit of their shareholders, but it's also an important concern for the state, which needs to develop the right sort of economic policies and maybe even monetary policies and lending policies to make sure that as long as this window of opportunity exists, we can actually upgrade the economy, upgrade the industry, and reduce our own emissions. Now let's discuss various decarbonization scenarios and pathways. Now, when the strategy was being developed, lots of calculations were performed in line with various scenarios. Now, there is the scenario which is the baseline for the strategy itself. I guess that all the important turning points are shown in this slide, and there are in fact 4 important indicators here. One is the volume of emissions compared to 1990, which actually corresponds to the first column here. The second one is the economic growth you can actually have with this kind of emission reduction. And the last important indicator is whether it can actually provide carbon neutrality for the Russian economy, and if so, when. So these are the 4 important indicators because, they actually form 4 basic scenarios. You can embellish on them and identify sub-scenarios, but these are the 4 big ones. So business as usual will give us 64% by 2050, which means that business as usual, or the inertia, okay, let's call it business as usual scenario, is unacceptable given Russia's NDCs and given the overall thrust of the globe, of the world. The second scenario involves moderate technological decarbonization. That's the 42% scenario. Here, we will embrace a set of measures which will not result in dramatic increase in prices, which would happen if we embrace, say, the state-of-the-art technologies. The issue with this scenario is that although it will provide pretty high pace of growth at 3.1%, by 2050, we'll still stay at 42% of our 1990 emissions, which is not what we want to have. There are 2 other scenarios which will lead us pretty much to the same point. One is the so-called intensive decarbonization scenario, and this one will give us 75% reduction compared to 1990. But GDP growth will be capped at 2.6%. So compared to the previous scenario, it will cost us extra 0.5% of GDP growth until 2050. Obviously, that's a lot of money. And this way, we should be able to reach carbon neutrality by roughly 2060. Another scenario, something that we actually prefer, is a combination of moderate technologically driven decarbonization coupled with active use of the potential of the Russian forestry industry. This way, we will reach the target of 20% by 2050 and carbon neutrality by 2060 while still enjoying 3% GDP growth per annum. A more aggressive scenario, which is a combination of intensive technologically driven decarbonization with active use of forestry, will give us 2.5% growth and carbon neutrality by 2055, and actually will mean 97% reduction of our 1990 emissions by 2050. But it's not considered attractive given that it will cost extra 0.5% of GDP growth. So I'm showing here some of our calculations which enabled us to justify a particular number, which is now contained in the strategy. And one of the arguments that Russian president used to justify and explain how we're going to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. So shown here are some technological and ecosystem factors, and the split is 60-40. And, well, at least the name of the chart is that it's the volume of net emissions of GG in Russia. Currently, Russian LULUCF is not contributing that much. And the way I see it is that unless we actually do a lot and we invest heavily in decarbonization in the coming years, we will not be able to reach carbon neutrality. I believe we need a large cross-disciplinary research thrust here, comparable to what was performed at some point in time in nuclear technologies and then space tech. We actually need to bring together, people from, say, oceanology and climate science and physics, and even from the unnatural sciences, such as economics. And we need great contribution from fundamental sciences for sure. There are three things that should give us the biggest impact in terms of reducing our emissions. One is power sector and household consumption, and say utilities. Actually, we have regions where generation is quite efficient, but in terms of consumption, everything is lousy. And there are regions where instead, or on the contrary, we need to first take care of generation. Another important area is fugitive emissions. Leading Russian companies are already doing quite a lot, and still there is so much potential there. In fact, even accounting for fugitive emissions is not really done well in Russia. And when companies start getting serious about them, it may turn out quite unexpectedly that their fugitive emissions are lower than they thought. And we also need to get serious about waste management. And actually, it's a politically sound measure because most Russians believe that waste, and you probably know that recycling is not really happening in the Russian Federation, so most of it gets in landfills, is one of the key environmental factors that Russians care about. So waste management should be reconsidered as a very important lever for developing the economy. So understanding the levers that we have in order to manage our emissions should help us develop sound industrial policies to support such a change. Fyodor Veselov previously touched upon this particular subject as he was talking about future changes in electricity consumption. Now, this slide shows the correlation between electricity consumption growth and GDP growth. And we're showing here primarily countries that have been growing at like 3% per annum in terms of GDP over the past, 30 years. So elasticity coefficient here is around 1. There are some very low indicators as well. Take Czech Republic and Poland. Their elasticity is at 0.2 or 0.3. So the question is, what kind of elasticity coefficient will Russia have? Well, our position is that indicators like those enjoyed in Poland and Czech Republic can hardly be found here because the whole strategy of low carbon development is primarily targeting electrification of industrial processes, be it electric arc furnaces or usage of plasma in metallurgy, electric transportation, and so on. And this very low elasticity, which was characteristic for Eastern European countries in early zeros, will hardly be possible. And in fact, Russia needs to intensify some of its industries, which is the inverse of what Poland and Czech Republic had to do 15 years ago. So I think that elasticity coefficient for Russia can be around 0.4, maybe 0.5. However, I am aware that this is not the only take on this particular issue. Here I'm showing potential changes in electricity generation increase. So going from left to right, road transport, metals, buildings, real economy, so to speak, except or like real industry except for metals, and final ones were railroad transportation and something else. Something you are discussing in detail now is the whole issue of substitution of hydrocarbons with hydrogen. There are some issues in this development. On the one hand, the economic potential of hydrogen exports from Russia by 2050 is estimated like 150 million tons. However, the specific numbers we put in the hydrogen development strategy are based on a very ambitious assumption that Russia will be supplying like 30% of global hydrogen. Well, that would make Russia the global leader in the hydrogen market, which is extremely ambitious. Russia, for example, only accounts for like 7% of the global oil market. That's why I actually believe we should not pin our hopes too much on hydrogen in our low carbon development strategy. Possibly a last comment is that introduction of various taxation schemes and carbon taxes will mean not just losses for businesses, but they will also impact prices. So if we introduce carbon taxes or similar tools inside a country, then with different carbon prices from say $10 to $50, 10 to 50 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent, additional price increase can easily be around 4%. Such an increase in CPI, in consumer price inflation, may be considered inadmissible by many countries and many political leaders. So rather than running ahead of the steamship or ahead of the train, as the Russian saying goes, we should very thoroughly consider what works and what doesn't for the Russian economy. I mean, major changes can easily be triggered by political agreements, but their economic consequences need to be thoroughly studied. COP26 conference is over, but they didn't end with a full stop. They ended with a semi-stop, so to speak, and a lot still needs to be done. Industrial low carbon development strategies still need to be developed, and they will also specify by how much individual industries and individual segments will need to reduce their emissions. And this, at least in some countries, will require some very difficult discussions between the state and the private sector. And we also need to perform a research breakthrough in terms of finding ways to assure fast reduction of emissions at the smallest cost to the economy.